Well, welcome everyone. This is an incredibly special version issue of Life on the Edge for the Venus Edge this month. And we're grateful and honored to have Dr. Julio Palmaz and his son, Christian Palmaz, who run a winery out in Napa. And I've had the good fortune of visiting, and I can say I'm a proud club member. They are absolutely spectacular wines. And you're so gracious to spend your time with us. I have, of course, Tony Gasparis with me, who's been with me on the last versions of Life on the Edge. So we're looking forward to tasting some wine today. And before we get started, let's talk about which wines we're going to be tasting, gentlemen. Just a brief overview of the three that we're going to be trying.
Yeah, so we're kind of tasting the current lineup, right? So we have 17 Riesling, 17 Chardonnay, and then the 16 Palmaz Cab.
Beautiful. Yeah. So I guess we're going to start with the Riesling. And, you know, I think when most people think about Rieslings, they're thinking about, of course, German and Austrian Rieslings tend to be on the sweeter side, depending upon how long the grape is spent on the vine. I'm pretty much at the limit of my knowledge on Rieslings, but your Riesling is definitely lower in sugar content, and I absolutely love it. But what sets your Riesling apart from what people traditionally think of Rieslings?
It's difficult to say I am better than the traditional Rieslings, particularly German, because they probably have a state of the art. Rieslings are interesting wines, and like you said, they're fruity and very aromatic. They have some strange qualities, like one of them is that they have even an aroma of diesel fuel in them.
The petrol notes.
Yeah, that's right, a little petrol to it, which, it sounds like an awful flaw, isn't it? But in reality, it's present in some Rieslings, and on and off, we detected it in our Rieslings. Not every year.
A little age. The little age starts to show up.
Yeah.
The younger Rieslings.
All of a sudden, like a little whiff, just a very fleeting characteristic, and then it disappears. But at any rate, Rieslings are typical sipping wines. You don't have to eat with them like you do with Cabernet, and they're great for summer. Warm weather. Sunny tables, and they're wonderful, funny wines. Actually, you cannot take them too seriously because there's not great complexity in Rieslings, but it's a fun wine, and it's always a prelude to something else.
That's a good way of putting it. Go ahead. Sorry.
With our Riesling, because it grows at the higher elevation, right? So we have vineyards at 3 different elevations across Mount George. We kind of get away with making this wine in that Alsatian style, right? So in the world of California Rieslings, there's different styles, but typically you see a little more of a sweeter tinge to it. Whereas with this is more kind of in the European flavor, where it's below 1% residual sugar, more in that, like what you were talking about, like more that Alsace, or Johannesburg style Riesling.
I can tell you my wife is not a Riesling drinker, but she looks forward to your Riesling release every year because it is, the Spätlese, the Cabernet Rieslings are overpowering, almost syrupy and coat the palate. Right. That's her palate. And this Riesling, if you were to pair it with food, what kind of food comes to mind?
I like spicy with the Riesling. I think, like Indian dishes, Mexican. Riesling goes really well with foods a little bit of heat. Thai, yeah, it's great. Yes. It's tough to, or it's actually really difficult to pair wines with those kinds of flavors because they tend to be, kind of not very, beer tends to go well.
On the other hand, it go great with fruit. If you want to have a happy hour with, bits of fruit,
Yeah, you're right.
Pineapple and
strawberries. It's true.
Well, they're wonderful because they bring up those flavors very well. Yeah.
Typically, sorry. Go ahead.
Compared to other wines, the Riesling, how easy is it to produce?
Well, it's a challenging wine to produce because it needs such a specific condition. I think, as far as Napa goes, Napa, which is so friendly to, the Bordeaux varietals, of course, Cabernet, Petit Verdot, Cab Franc, Merlot, Malbec, they do great, right? But Riesling, if it doesn't grow in the right conditions, give Riesling too much, and it tends to become that bubblicious, super fruit forward, syrup bomb. I think Kush is the word you use.
Yeah.
It gets there too easily. So you gotta put Riesling in a really restrained environment, which is why that we're just so happen to have that kind of the right conditions up there at 1200 to be able to do it. But I actually think from a technical perspective of what we do in Napa, this is actually one of the hardest wines to make.
Yeah.
So it ain't worth it from the business point of view.
Well, no, that's for sure.
Well, Tony, we're going to open this up when we barbecue at your house because, grilled food, I can imagine this goes
All
spectacular.
right. Thank you.
So, you talked about your winery, and you do have, I've had the good fortune of being there, you have a winery that I think blends the new with the old technique in such a very different way. And your winery's been called amongst the most technologically advanced in the world. So how do you combine the science of winemaking with the art of winemaking? And it's a lot like medicine, science and art coming together.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Well, we do
my
have a
dad,
history.
my dad had a lot to do with why the winery
We
took
do
off.
have a history, which is always gives you a great sense of respect and honor to be in a place that has been making wine since the 1800s. So that by itself is empowering. But definitely we went high tech. I started it. Chris pretty much finished it, and he's the one essentially bringing it up to new heights. And somehow we never lost the sense of the tradition. So we are blending very well here the technological advance edge and the tradition, and it's working out very well. We never felt any remorse about being technologically advanced.
Well, my father set a good tone for how to innovate in the winery, to sort of surround the process with innovation, but don't try to innovate the process itself. And, so we always used to say, the wine should never know what year it's made in. In other words, we don't want to rip open bags of innovation and pour innovation into the product. That's a different kind of innovation from what we do. We observe the process to inform us to make better decisions, to elevate the human element, not to suppress the human element in wine. So, that was a good thing.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, innovation, Julio. You're a pioneer when it comes to in medical device innovation. How and why did you get into vineyards and winery?
That's simple, because I trained at UC Davis, and in the 70s, and during the weekends when I had the chance to get away, I would go to wineries, and that's my wife and I developed this hobby of going, do winery hopping in Napa, Sonoma.
In your white Triumph Spitfire.
I just bought a brand new 1976 Triumph Spitfire, and it was a lovely little sports car, and it took me around the wineries, and we did picnics and, by duck ponds, and bought cheese and wine, and had a great time. I developed essentially a passion for this area before I went to Texas for 21 years, where I kept on dreaming about coming back.
One of my partners, I believe, visited you while you were in Texas, and you were doing the early tips procedures while you were down there, and he went down, and this is before I think we even had stents, right? I think people were just ballooning it open. So, and then of course you were instrumental in bringing the stent about. So that's your legacy. But you guys are still involved in the medical device community. And I was talking to Christian a little bit about this, and you're bringing it from the macro level where you originally innovated to the micro level. Tell us a little bit about your current work and ventures.
Well, I mean, it's all about opportunity, all right? Because things that you dream a certain point in life, 10 years later, you have the things have become reality, and now you can actually materialize things that you have conceptualized before. In my case, Chris was part of that for me, because he was trained in areas that I couldn't get into, computer science and geoscience and all that, and so eventually, he completed my vision. So we complement very well in that respect.
But you began asking the question about what was the material behind the stents, and I mean, you drove the.
Well, yeah. I always wanted to complicate my life. I mean, yeah. In fact, people have told me, why you get in trouble so much? Just look for simple things, man. I mean, don't get so complicated.
Yeah.
Well, Tony and I talk about L-Joloi and nitinol, and you guys are going like way deeper, like as Christian said, it's not my word, the Legos, the building blocks of these new devices, and how it's going to fundamentally change, just as revolutionary as nitinol was when it came out of Maryland so many years ago.
What happened was that the original stent, if you think about if you looked at the specification for the original Pulmos stent, these were very, very big chunky features, right? But if you look at today's intracranial stents, or you look at the kind of features that the industry is wanting to build for tomorrow's devices, you're kind of up against the limits of what wrought-based, foundry-based materials can provide, right? And so there was kind of two sides to it. My dad was studying, he was putting stents under, Tofsim machines and studying, surface heterogeneities and looking at intergranular, boundary contaminants and studying the remnants of lubricant process during the foundry, the tube dyeing process. I mean, there was so much interacting, and when you bring things down to the spectrum of an endothelial cell, and you talk about purity and fatigue performance, like you said, you do ultimately need a smaller Lego block, and that's basically what he started 20 years ago, and today Vactronics, our company is sort of lending is a new version of manufacturing using high energy physical vapor deposition to atomically build up materials at a much higher purity level.
I mean, that's going to be tomorrow's process. Yeah.
Christian, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Chardonnay?
Yeah. Well, the Chardonnay is if it's a little bit of a departure from the typical.
It was mom's wine.
Yes.
Be careful.
Carries my mother's name, so we call the Amalia Chardonnay, and it's very much appropriately named because she was the one who wanted this very Burgundian style of Chard, and so to do that, you have to whole cluster press the grapes. You got to ferment them in French oak barrels. You got to do all the things that is kind of done in that style, but you also have to control the temperature while doing it. So we basically had to build a section of the winery specific to be able to pull this off. And
it's a meat locker.
It's kind of like a meat locker temperature, right? So we actually it's the only part of the cave system that we actually further air condition lower than the 65 degrees or 60 degrees that the standard cave temperature is. And so the Chardonnay was kind of born out of that style. So it's it's 100% malolactic. So in other words, it's converted 100% malolactic, but it doesn't have that like buttery, like 2x4 cocktail that we kind of joke about, in the industry. It's done right. It's done with great balance.
I guess, I mean, at least from my point of view, I mean, Riesling is simple wine, fairly simple in its dimensionality, We can call, if we call this a single dimension, this is a three-dimensional wine.
Yeah.
And then Cabernet, you're talking about multiple layers over layers and layers.
Yeah.
So, but it's amazing that each wine reflects the amount of work that we put into it. The investment in wood, the investment in process, and definitely Chardonnay is a quantum leap above the Riesling, we have the blessing of having superb grapes.
Yeah.
And the grapes, probably add the most important dimensional.
Well, it's cool that, we have these, with the Chardonnay, because we have these three different elevations, we grow the grapes at the warmest part of the property and at the coldest part of the property. So think about it like, if you're thinking Napa Chard, think of like Carneros and Atlas Peak at the same time, like blended as one. So it gives this wine this kind of, great like mid palate structure with all that, the fruit components that you get from, say, Carneros, with that minerality and aromatic quality that you can only get from the mountain, like in the side of like Atlas Peak. And you put it together, and it's kind of the whole package. I mean, this wine to me feels like Montrachet just from Napa, right? And it has that kind of quality, which is good, because we always joke this wine has one customer, and it's Mom. So
you better be right. Well, they talked about the cave, and Tony's like, "Did you know about the cave?" I'm like, "You ask about it." So Tony, bring up your question about the cave.
Well, I mean, it's the largest cave in Napa, right? I mean, over 100,000 square feet or so?
Yeah, but I think it's 110,000 square feet. It's equivalent of an 18-story building, tall into Mount George, and then 3 city blocks deep.
Wow.
That's amazing. And your wine, and I think I remember this from, the state ambassador that took us around, a pump never touches it, which is unusual, correct?
That's right. Well, I mean, like, you want to talk about gravity flow? That was,
it's very difficult to live by a principle, and that's the way we develop a winery, and, I came to this valley totally unaware. I think they saw me coming from miles away, He said, I'm the guy with a money bag, and he's willing to do something different. And so they were expecting me, And the minute I arrived, they say, do you want to be, sound like a guy that is going to build a gravity flow winery. And I said, say what? He said, yeah, gravity, that's all. They got into this issue about that, pumps kill wine, So the whole idea, I said, you bought this piece of property that actually is pretty impressive, because it has that separation in height over a pretty small horizontal distance. In other words, you have pretty steep slope in your little valley. That means that you don't have to travel, 10 miles to be able to get into the guts of a winery. You are there within 300 feet. Yeah. And so it took a while for me to understand the concept, but then, once you get there, it's pretty seductive. Sure. Bring the wine down by gravity the way, Romans made wine 400 years ago. And yes, the idea is not to disrupt the molecular structure of wine, particularly reds, by, not having to propel them through any kind of action that will bring low areas of, pressure, shear, and all that a pump actually does. So
I mean, you know, by the late 80s, there were some pretty major discoveries being made about, you know, tannin polymerization and the importance of tannins polymerizing and all those, you know, hydroxyl groups on the side attaching to other things. Tannins are like the vehicle that, you know, because what do? They attach to proteins. Your mucosa is covered in proteins. So it kind of makes sense, right? So if the winery is, let's say, not a gravity flow structure, and it's taking the you know, the wine through the process and it's beating it up every time we got to move the wine from point A to point B, you are inhibiting that natural tannin polymerization. So the theory became, I mean, kind of the standard in the industry by the mid 90s was be gentle with the wine, and everyone interpreted that differently. Some people said, well, I'll build a 2-story structure with an elevator inside. You know, we'll use gravity to flow from point A to point B.
Use horses.
Yeah,
you know,
you're right. The Italians, that winery.
That's right. They will pull the wine up with a horse over a pulley. And
this is not a new idea,
Yeah.
whether the science was there or not. You know, somehow, maybe it was because they didn't have electricity, but that could be another reason. But the real issue was that I think there was a sense to be gentle with the wine. There was a purpose to be gentle with the wine, and this was just an opportunity to take that concept from grapes to bottle without compromise. Right, this 240-foot tall structure, 18 stories of it underground, gives us enough height that at 1 atmosphere we can move the wine through the process and have enough height left over to filter and bottle. Right, without having to compromise.
So let's quickly review. Probably you know this, and I don't want to be overbearing, but the idea is, you know, tannins bind to the mucosa through their proteins, and the binding capacity of the tannins is actually proportional to the length of the polymer of tannin. So you have, say, gallic acid, and you have, you know, you have 2-3 monomers in a, you know, essentially a polymer. And the ability to bind to the mucosa will be smaller than if you had the same polymer in a chain of 10. Simply because there's more binding sites. It's very, actually, it's just, you know, physical chemistry. So the problem is every time you apply a shear force, these polymers break apart. In fact, these polymers are pretty weak in terms of you know, their ability to resist shear forces. So, you know, it makes sense that when you have this very expensive wine, say you have a wine that is 120 years old, and they bring in with this decanter and they treat it like a baby, and they pour it incredibly gently to your glass. It's because they're not trying to break those polymers. You know, the depth and the character of the wine depends a lot on the preservation of those polymers, all right? So that's the idea behind, you know, gravity flow, so that you don't use these pumps that invariably every pump has areas of low pressure and high pressure, low pressure, high pressure, no matter what it is, whether it's a roller pump or is, you know, is a screw pump or it's a piston pump. They all work in the same way.
Yeah.
So, and if they're very severe, they even produce cavitation, and they produce, you know, they bring gas out of solution, and they do all kinds of mean things that would alter the chemistry of the wine. The chemistry of the wine is, at the end of the day, a very, very, I mean, it's very feeble, it's very delicate.
Yeah.
And these things, you know, the wine bottle is actually a reactor, isn't it? Where all these chemistries are actually evolving over time, and this multiplication factor, more and more chemistries are actually produced in there over time. And you know, you have to preserve all that.
So
you know, it's not a straight line up. I mean, it'll get to a point where it gets to a point of optimal, and that's probably where the wine tastes the best. And then it starts decaying with, you know, the oxidation actually started working against, you know, all those properties. But we're talking about years, all right? Years.
Decades, yeah.
Yeah, decades.
Right.
So with the Chardonnay, what foods would you recommend? Or
Oh, I mean,
Compliment.
you could go any direction in the Chardonnay. I mean, of course, you know, all of the the
Fish.
the seafood
Fish.
and yeah,
Absolutely.
But this wine is actually
Wonderful,
is
delicate fish and,
as big as it
Mediterranean.
is, though.
and cheese.
You could throw it at this wine when they're structured like this. These are the kinds of wines that you could actually put in a dark glass, right? Like a black glass, and really well trained, people who know wine will begin to confuse wines like this with reds. So if you hide them in amongst Pinots and Syrah and Cabs and Merlot, and you stick a Chardonnay in there in a dark glass, and you'd be surprised how many people start saying, there's no way this is a white wine, right? And it's incredible how
very extracted.
Yeah, it's very extracted, and it's really impressive. If you ever want to play that game on yourself, buy some dark glasses and throw white wines in amongst reds. Everyone thinks like, well, of course I can tell a white from a red apart. It's harder than you think sometimes in the right setting. With the right wine.
Talking about experts, how can somebody that's just starting to develop an interest in wine, how do you become an expert like you?
Geez, I'm not an expert.
You pretend.
Yeah. Yeah, pretending is great.
There's a lot of pretending in this business.
The reality is that you can spend your entire life reading and just absorbing information about wine. It's not going to taste any different to you, right? So, so just trust what you like. Buy what you like, and
Bingo. That is the most important thing. I had the opportunity to meet Michael Mondavi, before he passed, in the Valley when I was a young resident here and beginning to build his caves, and he was so profound in his simplistic approach to this. He said, two most important things: you need to like what you do. He said, if you like it, you're already halfway there. He said, the other thing is, it's family. He said, do it with your family, because that is what that is what is the other important point of success. He said, you cannot, I don't know why he was saying that. We know that he had some problems of his own family-wise. But Michael was an incredibly inspired individual. He
Robert.
Definitely was. Robert, I'm sorry. He was definitely the patriarch of this valley, and everything he said was so inspiring.
He's an amazing guy.
What an amazing guy! I just can't say enough about him.
So we should move to the red.
Yeah, let's talk about the red. This is the main stage, right? So this is 2016. 16 was a great vintage. 17 was a great vintage, but 16 was, it'll probably be remembered as one of the great years of Napa, along with years like 2012, 2008, in that caliber. This wine is, has I think 4 of the 5 Bordeaux in it. I'll pull up the tasting notes here. But really extracted. The 16 is it's been out. Now we're about to roll out the 17, so it's got a little bit of time on it. It's no longer, when these wines are right out of the gate, they can sometimes have some kind of youthful, not to use a ridiculous wine term, but like youthful angularity. So they have kind of like they kind of don't fit the glass sometimes. It takes a little bit of time to integrate all that complexity. This wine is doing that now, right? So it has this beautiful structure. It has a really pronounced, beginning, middle, and end that just ends and just goes on and on and on and on. It's a long finish. What do you say?
It's so complex. Yeah.
The fruit is just.
Yeah. So I guess to more describe what I mean is on a really young wine, the fruit may feel like it's disjointed from, say, a mineral component and an aromatic component, and it takes a little bit of time. But just, even just 6 to 8 months, right when the wines are released, they'll generate that kind of integration where everything starts to feel like it's clicking, and then, from then on, it's all gains.
One thing that is, unfortunately, we cannot pass that along. You need to be here. But going with your dog out there in the vineyard by harvest time, and you go to the parcels that have not been picked yet, and you go picking grapes, and you taste them. There's a lot of that in this glass, because the grapes, develop so much complexity in just a few weeks. From being simple to all of a sudden develop all these multi-layered tastes, The persistence is there too. I mean, you have one grape that is already kind of starting to get a little dull on the skin, and it's starting to get jammy.
Maybe wrinkles
and
a little
all
bit.
of a sudden you say, wow. I mean, and it stays on your mouth, and you just, the taste bangs around. And then, isn't it wine? That's a wonderful thing. You can translate the qualities in the grapes so perfectly to the wine. Yeah.
And the smell of this thing is unbelievable.
Yes, through the smell, through the bouquet, and then in the aftertaste. I mean, it's just wonderful. I mean, it's something that you can, so wonderful, you can put it in a bottle and cork it and keep it. And the same thing will be there 10 years from now.
So I remember being at your vineyard and somebody pointing out that look at the vineyard. They're not regular shapes. They're not square-shaped plots. They're jagged and
I know.
Soil samples. And I'm going to just let you explain.
Well, that was, the history of this place. It was originally founded by a guy named Henry Hagen. I mean, late 1800s. Europeans coming out of Europe, a lot of them fleeing the phylloxera infestation in Europe, coming to start over, Henry Hagen planted vineyards in really the same locations we have them today. The only difference is, maybe he didn't have access to, geologic core samples and all the laboratory assisted understanding of the soil structures and hydrological understanding. Today, the same locations that were proving so well during his era continue to do very, very well today. The only difference is we were able to design the vineyard to make the most out of the terroir. I mean, so there's no such thing as homogeneous soil, right? I mean, it doesn't exist. Particularly in Napa, where the property transitions from the alluvial deposits of the valley floor to what is the foothills of these mountain ranges, right? Napa is flanked by 2 mountain ranges. You got the Vaca mountain range, and then you got the Mayacamas, right? And so the Vacas, which is on our side, on the east side, as you transition away from those alluvial fan deposits and get into the foothills, the soil changes so drastically in just hundreds of feet. And so you're going between all these, and guess what? It doesn't conveniently translate in perfect straight grids, right? So if you really want to bring the terroir into that fermenter so that the winemaking team can work with that ingredient on the blending table 2 years later, you got to plant the vineyard where the soil structure is. And yeah, that's why our vineyards look like puzzle pieces and not like a grid, right? And I think that's the flavor of modern modern viticultural understanding of soils and everything that goes with that. And when you plant different clones that have different leaf structures, this vineyard over here may be 26 degrees, oriented 26 degrees east of north. This one may be 42, right? Depends on how much, sunlight exposure you want on the morning side or the afternoon side of that vine. All these considerations are very, very advanced viticulture, but that is becoming the standard.
So, quickly to review, this area here, this valley, was actually the scenario of the 2 plates colliding each other, the Pacific and the continental plate, and causing all this wrinkling and up throwing and blending, and you go to 1,200 feet elevation, you find marine fossils. And you go all the way down to 300 level, and you have all these alluvial sands. And so this is a mess, geologically speaking, and that's what creates this incredibly variegated geological background. And together with the different sun orientations, it makes for the geoscientist, or the geotechnologies of somebody interested in all this, a real complicated issue.
But it's great because when you can express it in the glass.
The variety.
Yeah, I mean it becomes people who work in operations in wineries, think of them as the people who make paint. They make a color, and then winemakers paint paintings. So if you want to help the winemaker, give them a diverse set of colors to make their job more interesting and allows them to express what they're trying to out of the wines. I mean, that's all we're doing here is just taking this unique piece of land, this beautiful 640 acres, 64 of which are under vine.
Yeah, we are really not different. I mean, the rest of the valley does the same thing. The valley is complex, and it lends itself to make special wines, and everybody is doing really pretty artistic wines in here. It's not like when you go to Central Valley and you have 300-400 acres of flat land, everything is exactly the same from yard to yard to yard. Here is expression, everything is different. And whoever captures it best is the one that wins.
Wow.
Well said. Well, I want to thank you both. I mean, this is an education in wine and art, and from a young interventional radiologist to one of the forefathers of my specialty, it's an honor. Thank you, Tony.
All right, Coach Tony.
Thank you very much, guys. Cheers.
Thank you for sharing with us. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you for everything. We're going to have the information to contact the winery if you're interested in becoming a member of the club or purchase anything. It'll be at the bottom of this, and of course we'll have some maybe some links to some tasting notes or something like that along the side. We'll work that out. Again,
the next one, of course, we're going to have to do live at the winery.
Well, yeah, no.
Absolutely, yes. You have to taste grapes on the vines and wine right off a fresh, recently crushed wine.
Nothing's better.
And I've heard they make a mean paella.
That's a challenge. I'm not to gain so much weight.
Oh, God. All right, salute, guys. Thank you very much.
Good to have.
All right.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Cheers, guys.
But thanks so much.
Our pleasure. All right. Cheers.